Yeah.
So I think we should come closer just that I don't have to shout. Thank you so much all for coming. I've just landed, so it's about midnight my time, and there's not a lot of people on the plane. But I am really glad that we have this opportunity. And I wanted the opportunity, but what I want to do is to talk about the issues that have been happening in the last 10 weeks or so at UCT around the road statue and things related to that. Because I know that other people are talking about it, and I thought it would be an opportunity to try to spread the word through our ambassadors or our alumni. But I don't want to, by focusing on that, suggest that that is somehow what the university is about. And especially for those of you who haven't been to our functions before, some of you I haven't been before, there may be time at the end to just tell you all the good stuff that's happening at UCT, because it's really flying high at the moment. Lots of institutions partnering with us, foundations, giving us significant grants, bigger grants than we've never received before to do good stuff. And in some ways, this is a sideshow, an important sideshow, but the fact that we're focusing on it shouldn't overstate what's going on there. So I thought I'd do the way I would approach it, and as Trevor said, we'll leave lots of it for questions and answers. I thought I would start by saying, giving a bit of a chronology. The road statue, the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, I think almost all of you know the campus, but you may have been there at a time when it was in a rather inconspicuous position, because it was only in the 60s and 70s that it was moved to the position that it had been in. When the highway was built, it was moved in order to accommodate the highway. But where it's been for the last 40 years has been in the focal point of the university. The architecture is designed almost like an amphitheatre, very symmetrical, and the centre point of the campus, going up the stairs towards the Jamie Hall, is the road statue. And it's been a controversial statue from the moment it was given to the university in 1934, 32 years after Rhodes died, actually. It was controversial initially, particularly amongst Afrikaners, because of course Rhodes was the political leader of the Cape Colony, was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, and then he was the motivator, the driver of the Anglo-Boer War, the war, which was the war that destroyed the two Boer republics, and was preceded by this charade, Jamison Ray, after whom our hall is named, Jamison Hall, currently named, that's right. He's always been in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was very much the target of Afrikaans, and often we had a lot of Afrikaans students on the campus then. Stellenbosch University actually was the English university to start with, Victoria College, but it became an Afrikaans university in the late 40s. And then in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of you would have been there then, the road statue was the target of the left, because Rhodes was the ultimate mining magnate. He had been the person who was responsible for a whole lot of legislation with the precursor to apartheid legislation, such as the Land Act, the Red Grey Act, which expelled the black people from their lands, the early passport laws, which prevented people from leaving the mines on pain of incarceration. He was also, of course, the ultimate colonialist in that he thought it was absolutely appropriate to take land, and he wanted to, as he said, paint Africa red when he came to Cairo. And he did go quite far. His wars against the Ndebele and Lobengula in what became Rhodesia, named after him, were parts of his history. And if you look at what he used to say in Parliament and elsewhere, he was clearly racist. But in the 60s and 70s, people were hostile to him because they saw apartheid as a form of capitalism, as racial capitalism. And they argued that it wasn't so much about racism, it was about capitalism that was driving this. And so he was the target. After 1994, was increasingly the target of black students who saw him representing a colonialism, but a message that the university, or the university represented, what he represented, was the superiority of Western and white culture. Colonialists and Rhodes used to say this, that their job was to civilize the nation, to civilize the continent. The continent was the white man's burden. And that's what he represented, and that's what the university represented. I hope you don't have to change this. I'm not even listening to podcasts, I'm not even going to say this, but the university was set up in part to, part of its founding mission was to civilize the continent. So he represented it. But the truth was that there was never a seriously large movement of people. The management of the university was aware that this was an important, a serious irritation, more than an irritation, that it represented an old way of thinking, which was not appropriate to the new South Africa. And in fact, in October last year, in my inaugural speech in 2008, I made reference to the fact that we needed to review all of the symbols and statues that were on the campus, because the climate of the institution needed to change from being a white institution that feels white, that feels colonial. And some things you can change, some things you can't. You can't change the architecture, the Oxford architecture. Smart Hall is based on an Oxford architecture, and we don't want to change that. It's part of what's wonderful and valuable about UCT. But there are other things, such as the names of buildings and the symbols, which we can change, which we should. We didn't really do much about it, but in October last year, when we were planning this year's transformation program, this was on our agenda to review all the statues, to review the statue, all the names and symbols, and bring that under focus. But on the 8th of April, or 19th of March, one student, really very brave, came along, brought a bucket toilet from Khayelitsha in his days, and he planned this and did it alone. He didn't have the protection of a big organization or students to himself too much. He just came along and he wanted to express his outrage at the statue, and as he put it, the shame that he feels about, firstly, on the one hand, living in Khayelitsha and working and studying on the campus of this schizophrenic existence, and secondly, to say how the statue makes him feel. Anyway, so he threw poo on the statue, and that resulted in an eruption of protest. So the team got together, my management team, and we decided that actually we were on the same side of the student. It wasn't actually a fight between us. We all thought the statue should go. The difference, however, was that the students thought that the statue should just be taken away and there was nothing to debate, and it should be taken down immediately. And they were going to protest and occupy the building until that happened. Whereas for me, it was important to protect the idea of a university, that is a space where debate happens, that we don't succumb to mob pressure or populist sentiment. That we knew that it was an issue around which the campus was actually very divided, and probably, certainly, if I were betting on it, the vast majority, I would have said, were against the country. And there were debates to be had. And so what we agreed was that we would call an urgent council meeting for 1 month hence, on the 9th of April, because only the council could make it. And that leading up to the council meeting, we would have debates, we would consult alumni, and many of them we got over 900 emails from alumni around the world. We would have a convocation meeting, the student bodies would meet, and the Senate would meet, and the non-academic staff. And each of them would express views, and the aim ultimately was not to have a referendum or to see what the majority thought, but to collect the arguments and for council to consider these arguments. And in that sense, it went exactly according to plan. And the wonderful thing about it, really, I think very uplifting, was that in many of these meetings, such as the Senate meeting, which is basically the professors of the university, mostly people over 50, because most professors only get to professorship later on in life, mostly white. That is the reality of our professoriate. And I had known that it was divided. I had thought the majority would oppose it for reasons, and I'll come to those reasons. But actually, by the end of the debate, which the students were central to in the Senate, we had an almost unanimous decision. One person voted against it. And what that signaled was that people had open minds and they were willing to understand and listen to the issues. And the same happened with the convocation meeting and with the council itself. The council meeting obviously was unanimous. And the council, let me remind you, includes a recently retired constitutional court judge, a judge from the appeals court, Justice Harlan, very distinguished advocates and lawyers like Jeremy Gordon, and a whole range of people. So this is not a group of pushovers who are just bow to public pressure. Let me say something about, so what were the arguments? The arguments against moving the statue were primarily that a generic argument that says we should not airbrush statues out of our history. Roads and many other villains of the past are part of all of our history, whether you're black or white, that shaped us. And if you got into a mode of modus operandi where whatever was the political fashion of the day, you took down those statues, you put others, and when that changed, you changed your statues, that would really be a disservice to heritage, history, the opportunities to educate people, and the opportunities to pay tribute to people as well. So that's the one argument, a generic argument that you don't take on statues. And secondly, that even if the statues are about villains, and I don't want to spend time here, but I think there's generally widespread agreement. Even when he died, if you look at the obituary that was written to his roads, it was clear that a significant number of people thought that he was a bit of a rogue then. Olive Schreiner wrote a lot about him and condemned him for many different views and practices. But even if he was regarded as a villain, that would not be a reason not to take down the statue. So that was and then the issue of education opportunities. That's the main argument against it. Another argument is that the university is built today on land which he left in his will for the creation of the university. He didn't leave it to UCT, and UCT, of course, was formed 30 years before he was born. And UCT existed in the city bowl at Hiddink at the time of his death, and only moved to the current site 25 years after he died. So there wasn't actually a direct link, but he did leave his land for public good, including the hospital, including the president's estate, and including for educational purposes. And it was the trustees of the estate that agreed with UCT that it could be used for UCT at the time when UCT was looking for new space. But still he's a benefactor. That's the second factor that one should recognise his benefits. The arguments against for moving the statue were different. I mean, were obviously different. They were not arguing we shouldn't have statues or that we should wear Russian. In fact, they were saying there's a statue of Rhodes in the company gardens, and that should stay there. There are statues of other people like Kruger and others around the place, and those statues should stay there. What was significant about Rhodes is what it was saying about the university, not what it was saying about Rhodes. But because the statue was in this pride of place, in this focal point of the university, and it is the only statue. There are a couple of small busts, there's a bust of Fuller, Fuller Hall and a bust of Smith. But these are almost unnoticeable. They're really inconsequential. There are no other significant statues on the campus. This is the only person. And most people would think he's the founder of the university. And in the way that statues serve a certain function, it would be reasonable to assume that he embodied the values of the university and that the university was proud of him and saw him as some sort of hero and role model. And that was what needed to be changed. So The original proposal was that it should be moved to another part of the campus, a conspicuous part of the campus. In the end, the feeling was so strong that it should be moved to another site off the campus, but not that it should be destroyed. Either it should be in a museum, or maybe a Rhodes Memorial, which is up the hill, and which is part of Table Mountain National Park, or to the Rhodes House in Muizenberg. In other words, it should remain part of our history, should remain there for educational purposes. It should not be presented as an icon of history. So those were the arguments, and mostly the protests. The students wanted to occupy the Bremner building, which is the administration building, as part of this protest. And there is a long and quite proud tradition of occupying Bremner. Those of you who were in the late 1960s may remember a very famous sit-in that lasted 9 days around the Professor Mafeji, who was denied a professorship, denied a job by the Council of the University with government intervention. In the 80s, there was sit-ins in Bremner that lasted for a long time. So, and then of course, around the world today, occupying spaces is very common. Someone was mentioning to me that they were at the Association of Amsterdam University. The University of Amsterdam was having 2 months sit-in, which resulted in the Vice-Chancellor resigning in the end, actually. She handled it with police. That was protest. So this is not uncommon. I was just in Hong Kong, and there was even Hong Kong movement, largely driven by students as well. So we gave them permission to occupy Bremner, and by and large it was a very disciplined protest. Not a single class was missed. There was no disruption of classes. There was no vandalism. There was no, and that's not to be taken for granted. Protests on South campuses often result in fire hoses being used, classes possibly damaged, broken, etc. And I think we managed to contain the protest in a way that gave it an important profile, but didn't let it disrupt the functioning of the university as such. Now there were two incidents. There have been a couple of incidents that went wrong, and those were just unfortunate. They made me and others, I think, pretty angry about that. One was the council meeting itself that was making the decision. The students were protesting outside the council building, which you would expect, and that was fine. But they ran out of patience, and I don't want to make excuses for them, but their excuse is that the meeting was scheduled to be about an hour and a half. It wasn't actually scheduled for any time. We had informed the press that there would be a press conference at the end of the meeting, and we told them to be there at 7 o'clock. The meeting started at 5. And the meeting was going on at 8:30. It was still going on. There was no information on this coming out of the meeting. The students had been protesting and dancing and throwing for about 3.5 hours outside, and ran out of patience and got out of control. They came into the building and they invaded the council meeting itself, intruded into the council meeting. So the meeting had to be adjourned, and it was a very unpleasant situation. There was media with it. The media came in with the students, and that was, of course, broadcast all over the world. And we eventually, students were acting as negotiators and mediators, and most of the students eventually left, and we could carry on the meeting. We were right at the end, and we just had to vote. So we conducted a secret ballot, and the meeting was concluded. But the fact of invading was certainly unacceptable. It was not in line with the rest of the protest. And the second issue was when the statue was actually taken away, we allowed the students to manage that process, because really this accelerated action was a result of their protest and what they had done. And we wanted them to, we didn't want to take over that management of the removal. So they did that, and what they didn't do was to have an adequate cordon around the statue. And so some students managed to get onto the truck, and they put turned paint over the statue, which hadn't been done before. And that was, of course, big television news. Most of the international news, if you were in South Africa, you would have seen articles every day on the statue and the face. But in overseas, I think you would only see videos of the statue. spectacle was of the Statue of Liberty that made me feel, and the general impression judging from the crowd you will see was that this was like the Saddam Hussein statue coming down, the mob pulling down the statue of someone that they hated. Anyway, there's nothing we can do about that. That's that, you know, those things happen.
Can I ask a question? Because I know in England you've had some people disagree, felt strongly, blah blah blah. I don't know that people in the US care that much about the statue per se, but I think things people do care about are the prestige of the university, the notion of transformation, which I think we all agree needs to transform. It might seem a thesis 25 years ago that the university needs to transform, but there seems to be a sense that, I mean, let's just say this, is UCT going to remain a world-class institution? Is there a general acceptance that South Africa is entitled to and deserves and must have a certain number of a few world-class institutions, even if that means they are elitist in a sense?
Yeah. Let me just repeat your question, because I believe that the microphone doesn't pick it up. Is
Actually,
that right?
It did pick it up. Yep.
Great, okay. So good question, and I don't think this presents any threat at all to the university status, and it's important not to present transformation as in some ways in tension with excellence. And in fact, the arguments of the students and of those who are arguing for transformation is that what gives UCT its unique position, what makes it much more competitive globally, is not that it's a Me Too organization, the same as Columbia or the same as the Imperial College, but that it offers something unique. And what it offers is the diversity, both of the student body and of the faculty. And that having people who can sort of bring an African lens to a particular academic topic makes it unique and makes it something special. And so these aren't necessarily, they shouldn't be intentional. We have no reason to, and let me say that the black students it wasn't the only black students driving us. In fact, many of the pictures show you that it was a very diverse group of students who were driving us. But the black students who were driving us are very proud to be UCT students, and they're proud of UCT status and, you know, ranking in the close to the top 100 in the world, and that's what they want. That's why they come. And the ministers are proud. They also the children. They don't want UCT in any way to. And they're not. No one is arguing. No academic staff say that. No academic staff say that. It's arguing that the standards for promotion should be lowered. That's the last thing they would argue. What they are arguing is that we're not doing enough to accelerate their careers or to nurture them or to recruit in order to have more black professors, more black senior staff. But linked to your question is this. Although I've said about the statue, how important the statue was in symbolizing what was symbolizing colonial feeling of the statue, and it isn't about the statue. Most people who were involved in the protest had never really noticed the statue, and they didn't know much about roads before the protest erupted. It was through the protest that they learned what it said and what his attitudes were. So they didn't start off knowing that. But although once they knew that, they would express this pain that they felt. They didn't feel pain before they walked past the road, they just needed another statue. So we have to ask ourselves, why did this erupt in this way and generate so much emotion? If you've watched one of the videos of the Jamie Hall Assembly, you can't fail to be moved by the passion and sometimes the anger and the depth of emotion of the students who were speaking there. And that's about the broader transformation issue. What they're saying to us, these are black students now, is that they feel like they are visited. They feel like they're not treated as equals in the university. They don't feel like they belong there. And that's about the institutional culture. And in some ways, it's a more pressing issue today because it's a free country, because there's a black majority government, because it ought not to be the case than it might have been 20 years ago when they might have assumed that was the kind of university. And so part of the conversation has been to try to understand what is it that is so alienating about the environment for black students, for some black students, not all of them. So I'll just give you maybe 2 or 3 examples, and it helps understand what this emotion about, also have to understand what you have to do about translation, why it's not about standards or excellence. So the SRC president, who is very articulate, Mr. Lahamba, from Limpopo, he has written an essay explaining an essay which is a kind of tour of the artworks of the university. So he's walked through the library, he's walked through a couple of the humanities building and various other places, and he comments on the art. Now, in one of the places in the library, most of the artwork is a collection of photographs from very well-known anti-apartheid photographers from the 70s and 80s, like David Goldblatt, Makabani, and others. And if you and me were to look at that art, first it would ring bells with the art, with the photography we saw in the 80s, and we would immediately know this is anti-apartheid art, and we would understand that context. But when Mr. Mahapa looks at this art, he's a born freak, born in 1995 or so. He doesn't necessarily have that history or that context, and he doesn't even necessarily know when these photographs were taken, because it's not very well contextualized. There's a blurb that says something. What he sees is dozens of pictures covering all the walls, which show black people as exploited, as humiliated. For example, that famous picture of black mine workers who are being strip searched before they go in the privatization program. Black men naked, being searched to see if they've got diamonds or anything else. Or removed to rural homelands, it's just desolate, or living in shacks. And the whites reflected in these photographs reflect the authorities of the apartheid state. So what he sees is that this is what the university thinks of white and black people. White people are always in superior positions. White people are powerful. Black people are in an underclass. There are no pictures really of black people as role models. Role models are the portraits of past chancellors and vice chancellors and deans, who are all white and mostly men, and that's interspersed with this other work. So the art of the university says to you, you don't belong here, or if you belong here, we're sort of lifting you up from an underclass into being like us being like a European Oxford University. So that's one kind of element of the culture. Now, we don't want to take down the artwork. Artwork is meant to be provocative, it's meant to be the artwork companies. But we can balance it with other artwork. We can contextualize it. We can do much better around education. And maybe we should move some of it too, so that it's not so overwhelming. Second example, yeah. Okay.
No, listen, I don't see other people have questions, and I want to just keep it moving.
Of course, that's better. Better that way.
Anybody else want to? I'm going to go out and bring a bottle of wine so we can drink coffee. Yes.
I'm sure they can't hear you, but I'll repeat it.
There's a history in South Africa of the last 6 years. You represent a very positive history of blacks in South Africa that has happened in the last 2 years. And I think that I'm not saying my opinion. That's right.
Yeah.
The criticism of those students that the university is not stood in their shoes and looked at all of this in the university.
Exactly right.
That is very white, very retro, very conservative.
Yeah.
Not only relates to black, maybe to women and other groups of women.
No, I think you're right. So, it takes that sort of, it takes their eyes to show us how it's seen. We think the artists are making a progressive statement because they're showing how apartheid stripped people's dignity away and how it was used in the anti-apartheid struggle to highlight the inequity and the evil of apartheid. But if it's out of that context, or even reflecting that, it sends a different message. Yeah, David. Just David. I'm fully aware that running a university is by definition complicated. I guess my only question is, because I've had a fair amount of this background, is how do you make sure you're doing whatever is the right thing, you don't get influenced by a small minority that makes a lot of noise? And I'm not picking sides, I'm just making the point that any politician knows that small numbers can make a hell of a lot of noise, particularly in things metropolitan towns. And how do you, running the university, find the balance between that and other views to make sure that the action is not just somebody making noise?
So, I'll just try to answer briefly. I think that was our most important goal, and in this time I think we succeeded. In other words, what the mob wanted, or what not the mob, that's very pejorative. What the protesting group wanted was that the statue should come down with no debate. And the argument they gave was, this is our pain, this is black pain. You as a white person can't understand this, you can't feel this. And therefore, it's not something that is up for debate. And they illustrated this in some ways quite effectively by putting up some posters of Hitler one day on the January pillars. They were taken down within an hour or two. And they should have done better in contextualizing the point they were making, because of course it got interpreted as anti-Semitism in the first instance. But they immediately met with the Jewish students in the university. They apologized. They said what we were trying to do is to make a point. The point is that, do you think it's completely unacceptable to have a portrait or a statue of Hitler anywhere in your presence? It pains you, it's offensive, it's not something you think can be rationally debated, or which people can have simply a view on, and you can take to Senate. There are some things which are so obnoxious that if you want this to be an inclusive university, you want us to feel like we belong here, then you would know better than to put posters of Hitler or statues of Rhodes up. So that was their argument, that in a sense it should just come down. There can be no debate about it. What we managed to protect was to say, well, it's much more contested than that. It's the case where almost everyone in the world shares that view. This is a case where there are lots of people who admire Rhodes, and he did some good